The morning cold bit through leather gloves as Hauptmann Werner Vogel pressed his palm against the turret ring of his Panther tank, feeling for the hairline fractures that had become his obsession. March 17, 1945, and the proving grounds at Hillersleben stretched beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. The telegram had arrived 3 hours earlier, carried by a courier whose mud-spattered motorcycle suggested urgent kilometres covered through the spring thaw. Werner still felt the paper's texture between his fingers, that particular weight of official Reich correspondence that preceded uncomfortable truths. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, Kiel, stop. Penetrating hit through frontal armour. Stop. British anti-tank weapon. Stop. Report Hillersleben immediately for technical evaluation. Stop. 23 words that reduced Friedrich, who had survived Kursk and the Falaise pocket, who wrote poetry in the margins of his maintenance logs and dreamed of teaching literature in peacetime, to a statistic in the Wehrmacht's lengthening casualty lists. Werner pressed his forehead against the Panther's cold steel, remembering Friedrich's voice during their last conversation, excited about a letter from his wife describing their daughter's first words. The boy had possessed that rare combination of tactical brilliance and profound gentleness that marked natural leaders, if they lived long enough to matter. Now he was ash in a burned-out Panther somewhere near the Rhine, killed not by superior Allied armour, but by something the intelligence reports called an armour-piercing discarding sabot round. Werner didn't fully understand what that meant yet, but he understood the fear in the words, the way even seasoned Panzer commanders now spoke in hushed tones about British 17-pounder guns that punched through German armour like paper. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Herr Hauptmann. Feldwebel Otto Becker's voice carried across the proving ground's concrete expanse, respectful but edged with the concern that had grown familiar among Werner's subordinates. They'd all noticed his increasing preoccupation with penetration statistics, his obsessive study of metallurgical reports, his habit of questioning armour specifications with the intensity of a prosecutor cross-examining hostile witnesses. Colonel Steiner wishes to see you immediately. Werner straightened, brushing frost from his uniform. Colonel Heinrich Steiner maintained his headquarters in the Proving Ground's main administrative building, a brutalist concrete structure that embodied the Reich's architectural philosophy of dominance through mass. The colonel's office occupied the building's southwest corner, positioned to overlook both the ballistic testing ranges and the railway siding, where damaged tanks arrived from battlefields across Germany's collapsing empire. Steiner stood behind his oak desk like a recruiting poster from a different war, his uniform pressed to mathematical precision, his Knight's Cross positioned with geometric exactitude above his left breast pocket. The colonel had commanded Panzers during the France campaign, back when German armour superiority seemed self-evident, back when a Panzer III could defeat anything the Allies fielded. But 1945 was not 1940, and the comfortable certainties of the Blitzkrieg years had shattered against the industrial might of enemies who learned faster than German doctrine could adapt. Behind Steiner, morning light filtered through tall windows that framed the Proving Ground's distant impact berms, where the ghosts of failed armour designs seemed to hover in the winter air. Vogel. The colonel's voice carried the clipped authority of Prussian military tradition. I have a sensitive assignment for you. He gestured toward a leather chair positioned precisely 45 centimeters from his desk, a staging designed to reinforce hierarchical distance between staff officers and field commanders. You've heard about the British weapon that's been causing difficulties. Werner had indeed heard whispers about a new British anti-tank round that was changing the calculus of armoured warfare. Reports from the Western Front described Panther and Tiger tanks, supposedly invulnerable behind their sloped armour and advanced metallurgy, burning from frontal hits that should have been impossible. These accounts typically arrived at Hillersleben, accompanied by stern-faced ordnance officers who treated the damaged hulls like crime scenes requiring careful forensic analysis. A 17-pounder anti-tank gun, Steiner continued, consulting a file folder marked with security stamps that indicated highest priority intelligence material. British designation, Ordnance Quick-Firing 17-pounder, mounted on their Firefly variants of the American Sherman tank and on towed carriages. The colonel's expression suggested professional concern barely contained beneath bureaucratic composure. More troubling is their ammunition, something called Armour-Piercing Discarding Sabot, APDS in their terminology. Werner felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation that preceded every discussion of German armour vulnerability. Wehrmacht doctrine had emphasized the superiority of German metallurgy and armour design for years. The Panther's sloped frontal glacis, 80 mm of hardened steel angled at 55 degrees, had been calculated to provide protection equivalent to 140 mm of vertical armour. No Allied tank gun should penetrate it. No conventional round possessed sufficient kinetic energy to defeat German engineering at combat ranges. Yet Friedrich was dead, and the intelligence reports kept arriving with their litany of impossible penetrations. "Your assignment?" Steiner said, sliding a manila envelope across the desk's polished surface, "is to conduct comprehensive ballistic testing of captured British APDS ammunition. We've recovered several intact rounds from battlefield salvage operations near Wesel." The colonel's pale eyes fixed on Werner with bureaucratic intensity. "Berlin wants detailed analysis of the penetration mechanism, metallurgical composition, and vulnerability assessment for our current armour designs." Werner accepted the envelope, feeling its weight of official expectations. Inside would be technical specifications, testing protocols, evaluation criteria designed to understand how the impossible had become routine, how British ordnance engineers had developed ammunition that negated years of German armour advancement. The assignment represented exactly the kind of technical challenge that should have excited a Panzer officer with Werner's engineering background and combat experience. Instead, he felt the familiar dread of institutional pressure to find solutions that might not exist, to identify countermeasures against innovation that had fundamentally altered the battlefield equation. "The ammunition is designated Mach 1, Steiner added, consulting his notes. "Apparently introduced in 1944, though we're only now beginning to understand its effectiveness." The colonel's dismissive tone suggested he viewed the British achievement as temporary tactical advantage rather than fundamental technological leap. Typical Allied engineering, crude but occasionally effective through sheer material expenditure rather than sophisticated design philosophy. Werner nodded appropriately while processing the implications. If the British had fielded this ammunition in 1944, German intelligence had failed to recognize its significance for nearly a year. How many Panthers and Tigers had burned in that interval? How many Friedrichs had died while Wehrmacht ordnance bureaus dismissed Allied innovation as crude improvisation, unworthy of serious concern? The morning of March 21st brought the kind of bitter cold that made metal contact with audible pings, and Werner found himself standing before a captured British 17-pounder gun in Hillersleben's main ballistic laboratory. The weapon crouched on its split-trail carriage like some utilitarian predator, its long barrel painted in the olive drab that had become synonymous with Allied industrial pragmatism. 55 calibers long, 2.9 meters of rifled steel, capable of hurling a 17-pound projectile at velocities German engineers had considered theoretically impossible for conventional artillery. Feldwebel Becker approached with the methodical precision that marked his every movement, carrying a wooden ammunition crate stenciled with British ordnance markings. The crate's lid bore warnings in English about handling procedures and storage requirements. "Herr Hauptmann, the captured ammunition." Becker pried open the crate with practiced efficiency, revealing 6 pristine rounds nestled in protective packing material. Werner studied the ammunition with professional fascination tinged with apprehension. The rounds appeared deceptively simple. Brass cartridge cases topped with projectiles that seemed unusually slender compared to conventional German armor-piercing ammunition. Each round measured approximately 1 meter in overall length, the projectile itself far narrower than the 17-pound designation suggested. The discrepancy troubled Werner more than he cared to admit. German armor-piercing ammunition philosophy emphasized large, heavy projectiles that relied on mass and hardness to defeat armor through brute force penetration. The British rounds appeared to violate fundamental principles of kinetic energy transfer that had governed armor warfare since tanks first appeared on the Somme battlefields of 1916. Becker carefully extracted one round, handling it with the respect accorded to dangerous machinery. Notice the projectile diameter, Herr Hauptmann, approximately 76 millimeters, but the actual penetrator appears much smaller. He pointed to the projectile's nose, where a darker metal core was visible beneath a lighter aluminum sleeve. The British appear to have surrounded a sub-caliber tungsten penetrator with a disposable carrier that separates after leaving the barrel. Werner absorbed this information with growing unease. The concept seemed simultaneously elegant and revolutionary. By using a lightweight carrier sabot that fell away in flight, British engineers had circumvented the fundamental limitation of conventional armor-piercing ammunition. A small, dense penetrator could be accelerated to far higher velocities than a full-caliber projectile, dramatically increasing its kinetic energy and armor penetration capability. The implications extended beyond mere technical innovation to fundamental questions about German ordnance philosophy and the Wehrmacht's ability to maintain armor superiority against enemies who innovated faster than German doctrine could adapt. "Prepare the test target," Werner ordered, his voice steady despite the apprehension building in his chest. Panther frontal glacis, actual combat angle, range of 1,000 meters. The specifications represented typical engagement distances on the Western Front, where German armor fought increasingly desperate defensive actions against Allied material superiority. If the British APDS could penetrate a Panther at 1,000 meters, every German tank on the Western Front was vulnerable to weapons they'd been told couldn't threaten them. The test crew positioned a section of Panther frontal armor on the ballistic range, angling it precisely to 55 degrees from vertical to replicate actual tank configuration. The steel plate gleamed dully under the overcast sky, 80 millimeters of hardened armor that represented the pinnacle of German metallurgical engineering. Wehrmacht doctrine considered this configuration virtually immune to Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. The sloped angle provided effective thickness exceeding 140 millimeters, sufficient to defeat even the American 76 millimeter gun that armed late-war Shermans. Werner had staked his career on the superiority of German armor design, on the mathematical certainty that proper metallurgy and geometric optimization would preserve Panzer invulnerability despite Allied numerical advantages. Now he would watch that certainty tested against British innovation he didn't fully understand. Becker loaded the APDS round into the 17-pounder's breech with careful deliberation, the metallic clang of the breech closing echoing across the proving ground like a funeral bell. Werner positioned himself at the observation bunker, binoculars raised, watching the target through reinforced glass that had witnessed countless ballistic tests. The field telephone beside him connected directly to the gun crew, awaiting his firing order. "Stand by," he said into the telephone, his voice calm despite the tension coiling in his stomach. "Fire when ready." The 17-pounder's report cracked across the proving ground with shocking violence, a sound distinctly different from German anti-tank guns Werner had heard throughout his career. The muzzle blast created a visible shockwave in the cold air, and Werner caught a brief glimpse of something separating from the projectile mere meters after leaving the barrel. The aluminum sabot petals, he realized, fell away, as designed to allow the sub-caliber tungsten penetrator to continue downrange at velocities conventional projectiles couldn't achieve. The impact came less than 2 seconds later. Werner expected the familiar sight of a projectile ricocheting off sloped armor, the spark and whine of defeat that had protected German Panzers since the Panther's introduction. Instead, the target plate simply opened, the steel parting like fabric before a blade. No ricochet, no deflection, just clean, catastrophic penetration that sent fragments of armor plate spinning across the impact berm in glittering arcs. Silence settled over the proving ground like a physical weight. Werner lowered his binoculars slowly, his hands trembling slightly. Becker's voice crackled over the telephone, carrying the hollow tone of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had just shattered. "Herr Hauptmann, complete penetration, clean entry hole, approximately 8 centimeters diameter, massive spalling on the interior face." Werner walked to the target on legs that felt disconnected from his body, each step carrying him closer to truth he'd spent years avoiding. The Panther armor section bore a perfectly circular hole, its edges glowing faintly from frictional heating, surrounded by radial cracks that spoke of kinetic violence beyond anything German armour had been designed to withstand. He ran his fingers along the entry hole's smooth circumference, feeling the heat still radiating from tortured metal. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Wehrmacht metallurgists had calculated protection factors, analysed ballistic coefficients, optimised hardness profiles to defeat any conceivable Allied weapon. Yet here was evidence that British engineers had rendered those calculations obsolete through innovation German doctrine had never anticipated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Becker appeared beside him, his usually composed expression troubled. The mathematics are extraordinary, Herr Hauptmann. If we calculate the kinetic energy based on projectile velocity and penetrator mass. He paused, consulting a small notebook where he'd been recording measurements. The tungsten core weighs approximately 3.5 kilograms, but the Sabot design allows muzzle, velocity exceeding 1,100 meters per second, nearly twice the velocity of our comparable armor-piercing ammunition. Werner absorbed these numbers while staring at the ruined armor plate. The physics were brutal in their simplicity. Kinetic energy increased with the square of velocity, meaning the British APDS possessed roughly 4 times the penetrative energy of equivalent German ammunition, despite using a lighter projectile. The Sabot concept had circumvented fundamental limitations that German ordnance engineers considered insurmountable, producing a weapon that negated years of armour development through elegant application of principles Wehrmacht doctrine had overlooked. Test it again, Werner heard himself say, though part of him wanted to walk away, to unsee what he'd witnessed. Different angles, different ranges. I need to understand the complete vulnerability profile. Over the following 3 days, Werner watched British APDS ammunition systematically demolish every comfortable assumption about German armour superiority. At 1,500 metres, the tungsten penetrators punched through Panther glacis plates with only marginally reduced effectiveness. At 2,000 metres, they still achieved penetration that would be catastrophically lethal to crew members. Against Tiger frontal armour, supposedly immune to all Allied weapons, the APDS rounds penetrated with clinical efficiency at ranges exceeding 1,000 metres. Each test produced data that contradicted Wehrmacht doctrine more completely than the last. The aluminum sabot petals separated cleanly within 10 metres of the muzzle, allowing the dense tungsten core to maintain velocity with minimal aerodynamic drag. The subcaliber design minimized the projectile's cross-sectional area, concentrating kinetic energy on a smaller impact surface that overwhelmed armor's hardness through sheer pressure intensity. German armor-piercing ammunition, by contrast, relied on full-caliber projectiles that generated greater air resistance and delivered their energy across larger impact areas, reducing penetration effectiveness despite greater projectile mass. Becker's systematic data collection revealed patterns that troubled Werner more deeply with each passing hour. British APDS ammunition wasn't merely effective. It represented fundamental advancement in armour warfare that German ordnance philosophy had failed to anticipate. The Sabot concept originated from principles German engineers had dismissed as impractical, requiring manufacturing tolerances and metallurgical precision that Wehrmacht procurement bureaucrats considered unnecessary sophistication. Yet the British had implemented the design with industrial efficiency that suggested mature production capability rather than experimental prototype testing. How long have they had this? Werner asked one evening as he and Becker reviewed their test data in the ballistic laboratory's quiet office. Charts and graphs covered the desk's surface like accusations, each data point reinforcing conclusions. Werner found increasingly difficult to reconcile with years of confidence in German technological supremacy. Becker consulted captured British technical manuals they'd requisitioned from Wehrmacht intelligence archives. The Merc I APDS entered service in 1944, though development began earlier. Initial deployment was limited due to manufacturing challenges with the tungsten cores and sabot assembly. He traced a finger along production statistics that German intelligence had apparently underestimated. By late 1944, production had increased substantially. Current estimates suggest sufficient quantities to equip most British 17-pounder guns in northwestern Europe. Werner stared at the numbers while remembering Friedrich's eager face, his pride in the Panther that should have protected him. German intelligence had known about APDS for nearly a year, but had failed to communicate its significance to frontline Panzer units. How many commanders had died believing their armour would protect them, never understanding that British guns now possessed ammunition that made armour thickness almost irrelevant at typical combat ranges. The weight of institutional failure settled over Werner like physical mass, pressing the air from his lungs. The spring rain arrived on March 27th, turning Hillerslebens testing grounds into a landscape of mud and standing water that reminded Werner of photographs from the Somme. He stood in the observation bunker, watching water stream down the reinforced glass while Becker prepared for their most critical test yet. They'd received a Panther AUSF-G from the Western Front, a tank that had survived 3 months of combat before a track failure forced its abandonment near Remagen. The crew had escaped, but the tank bore the scars of modern warfare: weld repairs on the hull sides, hastily applied Zimmerit coating to prevent magnetic mines, and the exhausted mechanical fatigue that marked every German armoured vehicle struggling to survive against overwhelming Allied material superiority. "Ready when you are, Herr Hauptmann." Becker's voice carried through the field telephone with professional calm that Werner had come to recognise as carefully maintained facade. They'd both seen too much in the past week, too many penetrations that shouldn't have been possible, too much evidence that German armour doctrine rested on foundations that British innovation had undermined with ruthless efficiency. This test would determine whether German tank crews had any survivable engagement range against British 17-pounder guns equipped with APDS ammunition. Werner had positioned the Panther at 800 metres, the minimum distance at which German doctrine suggested Panthers could engage enemy armour with reasonable expectation of survival, while their own guns could achieve lethal hits. The mathematics seemed straightforward. German optics remained superior to Allied equivalents, and Panther crews were trained to exploit this advantage by engaging at ranges where they could see and kill enemies who couldn't effectively return fire. But doctrine assumed Allied weapons followed conventional ballistic limitations that APDS had rendered obsolete. "Fire," Werner ordered, his voice flat. The 17-pounder spoke with its characteristic sharp crack, and Werner tracked the barely visible trajectory of the APDS round as it crossed 800 metres in less than 1 second. The Panther's frontal glacis offered no meaningful resistance. The tungsten penetrator punched through the sloped armour with the same clinical efficiency Werner had witnessed at longer ranges, creating the familiar perfect circle of catastrophic penetration. Through his binoculars, Werner watched the interior of the turret illuminate briefly as burning propellant from the penetration ignited ammunition storage, the pale orange flash visible through open hatches that would have been closed in combat. "Time to penetration, 0.7 to 3 seconds, Becker reported, his voice carrying the hollow precision of someone documenting a funeral. At this range, German crew response time would be insufficient to identify threats, acquire targets, and return fire before receiving a catastrophic hit. Werner lowered his binoculars slowly, processing implications that extended beyond technical specifications to fundamental questions about German tactical doctrine and the survival prospects of every Panzer crew on the Western Front. 0.7 to 3 seconds, less than 1 second between a British 17-pounder firing and a German Panther dying. No time for evasion, no time for countermeasures, barely time to recognise the muzzle flash before tungsten travelling at supersonic velocity rendered everything academic. The Wehrmacht's entire armour warfare philosophy emphasised the Panther's combination of mobility, firepower, and protection as force multiplier that compensated for Allied numerical superiority. One German tank, properly employed with superior optics and crew training, could theoretically defeat 3 or 4 Allied tanks through tactical excellence and technological advantage. But that calculus assumed German armour could survive long enough to exploit those advantages, and assumed that protection would provide the seconds necessary for skilled crews to demonstrate their superiority. APDS ammunition had eliminated those precious seconds, reducing armor warfare to brutal calculus, where whoever fired first won, regardless of training or tactical sophistication. "Test the Tiger," Werner said quietly, though he already knew what the results would reveal. The Tiger II, Germany's most heavily armoured production tank, mounted frontal armour 150 mm thick on its turret and glacis. Wehrmacht doctrine considered it virtually immune to Allied anti-tank weapons at any range, a mobile fortress that could dominate battlefields through sheer invulnerability. Friedrich had died in a Panther, but surely the Tiger's massive armour would provide some margin of survivability, some engagement range where German crews could fight with reasonable expectation of living through the encounter. The Tiger II they'd requisitioned for testing had arrived from the Sennelager Proving Grounds, a factory-fresh example with only 17 hours of engine operation and pristine armour that bore no combat scars. The Maybach engine turned over smoothly, its mechanical symphony unmarred by the wear that plagued frontline vehicles. Werner watched the 70-ton behemoth manoeuvre into position at 1,000 metres, its massive bulk projecting the invulnerability that German propaganda had promised would turn the tide of war. Becker loaded another APDS round with movements that had become ritual over days of testing, the metallic sounds of breech operation now familiar as breathing. Werner returned to his observation position, binoculars steady despite the tremor in his hands. The Tiger represented Germany's last psychological advantage in armour warfare, the final refuge of belief that superior engineering could compensate for industrial disadvantage. If APDS could defeat the Tiger's frontal armour at combat ranges, no German tank possessed adequate protection against British 17-pounder guns. "Fire when ready," Werner ordered. The Tiger's frontal armour, 150 mm of case-hardened steel optimized through years of metallurgical research, offered slightly more resistance than the Panther's sloped glacis. The APDS round required 0.1 to 8 seconds to complete penetration instead of 0.1 to 2. The difference was mathematically measurable but tactically meaningless. The tungsten core punched through the Tiger's supposedly impenetrable protection with efficiency that would kill every crew member within 3 meters of the impact point, through spalling fragments that turned the interior into a steel hurricane. Werner walked to the Tiger on legs that felt hollow, each step carrying him toward the death of comfortable illusions he'd maintained throughout his career. The penetration hole glowed faintly in the afternoon light, surrounded by radial cracks that testified to kinetic violence beyond anything German armour designers had anticipated. He climbed onto the Tiger's hull, peering through the penetration to examine the interior damage. The sight made his stomach clench. The rear turret wall bore massive craters where armour fragments had impacted at velocities that would shred human tissue like paper, creating a kill zone that extended throughout the entire fighting compartment. "No survivability," Becker observed quietly, appearing beside Werner on the Tiger's deck. "At typical combat ranges, first hit is crew kill, regardless of which German tank type." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "British have achieved tactical parity through technological innovation that negates our armour advantage. Every engagement becomes a mutual exchange where superior Allied numbers ensure German defeat." The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. If German tanks couldn't survive first hits from British 17-pounders, and if every penetration resulted in catastrophic crew casualties, then Allied numerical superiority became an overwhelming advantage that no amount of German tactical skill could overcome. The Wehrmacht possessed perhaps 3,000 operational tanks across all fronts. The British and Americans were producing thousands monthly, supported by industrial capacity that German production could never match. When armour protection became effectively meaningless, the side that could afford to trade losses would inevitably win through attrition. Werner thought of Friedrich, of Hans Kleiner from the reports he'd read about Sherman testing, of the thousands of young Panzer crewmen who'd climbed into their tanks believing German engineering would protect them. How many had died while Wehrmacht ordnance bureaus dismissed Allied innovation as crude improvisation? How many would continue dying while institutional inertia prevented honest assessment of German vulnerability? That evening, Werner sat in his quarters with Becker, reviewing their comprehensive test data over glasses of schnapps that failed to ease the tension building behind his eyes. Charts and graphs covered the small table like tactical maps of defeat, each data point reinforcing conclusions that would be unwelcome in Berlin's corridors of power. The APDS ammunition had penetrated every German armor type at ranges exceeding typical combat distances. No current German tank possessed adequate protection against British 17-pounder guns equipped with this ammunition. The report to Colonel Steiner, Becker began carefully. How do you intend to frame these findings? The question carried implications they both understood. Wehrmacht culture rewarded officers who provided solutions and optimistic assessments, while punishing those who documented problems without offering paths to victory. Werner's report would determine not only his career trajectory, but potentially influence German armor development and tactical doctrine for whatever remained of the war. He could emphasize theoretical countermeasures, additional armor thickness, modified angle configurations, reactive armor concepts that might restore German invulnerability. Such recommendations would align with institutional expectations about German engineering superiority and provide Berlin with a comfortable narrative that technical solutions existed if only resources could be allocated properly. The approach would preserve Werner's career while perpetuating the dangerous fiction that armor protection remained a viable defense against modern anti-tank weapons. Or he could report the unvarnished truth that British APDS had fundamentally altered armor warfare, that German tanks no longer possessed the protection necessary to survive against competent adversaries, that the Wehrmacht's armor doctrine required complete revision to emphasize mobility and first-hit capability over survivability through armor thickness. The truth, Werner said finally, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Every word of it. Penetration data, vulnerability assessments, tactical implications. He met Becker's gaze across the table. Friedrich died believing his armor would protect him. How many more will die if we lie about what we've discovered? Becker nodded slowly, relief visible in his expression. I was hoping you'd say that, Herr Hauptmann. He reached into his leather satchel, withdrawing a thick folder of documentation they'd compiled over days of testing. I've prepared comprehensive ballistic analysis, metallurgical comparisons, and tactical recommendations. The data supports only one conclusion. Current German armor doctrine is obsolete against modern Allied anti-tank ammunition. The telephone's harsh ring interrupted their discussion, Colonel Steiner's clipped voice demanding Werner's immediate presence in the administrative building. The colonel's tone carried bureaucratic urgency that suggested developments requiring immediate attention. Werner checked his watch, 21:30 hours, unusually late for routine communications, but appropriate timing for sensitive discussions requiring privacy from daytime administrative activity. Steiner's office remained illuminated despite the late hour, the colonel standing behind his oak desk with rigid posture that marked his Prussian background. Behind him, shadows from blackout curtains created geometric patterns across maps detailing Wehrmacht positions across collapsing defensive lines. The visual effect emphasized Steiner's role as staff officer managing information flow rather than field commander responsible for tactical reality. Vogel, I've received preliminary reports about your testing program. Steiner began without preamble, his pale eyes fixed on Werner with bureaucratic intensity. Certain aspects of your findings require clarification before submission to Waffenamt authorities. The colonel's tone carried implied threat beneath diplomatic language. Berlin expects documentation supporting continued Panther and Tiger production, not analysis that might question German armor capability or undermine crew morale. Werner felt familiar tension building in his chest, the same sensation that preceded every confrontation between truth and institutional expectations. 2 weeks of systematic testing had produced evidence that British innovation had rendered German armor doctrine obsolete. Yet his commanding officer was demanding reports that ignored inconvenient facts in favor of comfortable myths that would perpetuate the mechanical slaughter, consuming German tank crews across every front. Sir, the test data presents significant complications, Werner replied carefully, choosing words that acknowledged reality without directly challenging Steiner's expectations. British APDS ammunition demonstrates penetration capability that exceeds our initial assessments. The 17-pounder gun equipped with this ammunition poses a serious threat to all current German armor types at typical combat ranges. Steiner's expression hardened, his hand adjusting his knight's cross in a gesture Werner recognized as preparation for bureaucratic intimidation. Hauptmann Vogel, I trust you understand that defeatist assessments serve no purpose other than undermining German fighting spirit and operational effectiveness. Your report will emphasize potential countermeasures and validate continued investment in German armor development, or you may find yourself reassigned to positions where your analytical tendencies won't compromise Reich interests. The threat hung in the air like cordite smoke, unmistakable despite diplomatic phrasing. Werner realized he faced a choice that would define not only his career, but his fundamental integrity as both soldier and human being. He could produce false reports that preserved comfortable illusions while perpetuating armor designs that killed young tankers, or he could submit honest analysis that might cost him everything while potentially saving lives through improved German tactical doctrine. Werner thought of Friedrich's face, of the perfect circular hole in the Tiger's frontal armor, of the thousands of Panzer crewmen climbing into their tanks each morning, believing Wehrmacht engineering would protect them. The weight of preventable deaths pressed against his chest like physical mass. With respect, Herr Oberst, I cannot falsify ballistic test results. Werner's voice remained steady, despite the consequences he knew would follow. The data demonstrates clear German vulnerability to British APDS ammunition. Any report that denies this reality will contribute to continued Panzer casualties that proper tactical doctrine might prevent. Steiner's face flushed with aristocratic rage barely contained beneath professional composure. You are dismissed, Hauptmann. Your report will be submitted through proper channels, and your recommendations regarding your continued service will be forwarded to appropriate authorities. Werner saluted with mechanical precision, turned, and walked from the office on legs that felt disconnected from his body. The corridor outside seemed darker than before, shadows pressing close like physical presence. He'd just destroyed his career, he realized with strange detachment. By morning, orders would arrive, reassigning him to some punishment posting where his insistence on truth couldn't interfere with institutional narrative about German technical superiority. But Friedrich wouldn't die again, and perhaps Werner's honest report might reach someone with authority to revise German armor tactics before more young men burned in tanks that could no longer protect them. The April rain had returned by the time Werner reached his quarters, steady precipitation that turned Hillerslieben's roads into rivers of mud, reflecting the security lights in fragmented patterns. Becker waited inside, having already heard through the Proving Ground's informal communication networks about Werner's confrontation with Steiner. The Feldwebel had spread their complete test documentation across Werner's desk, charts and graphs, and ballistic analysis that told the story Steiner refused to hear. I've prepared 3 copies, Becker said quietly, gesturing to sealed envelopes addressed to different Wehrmacht technical commands. 1 through official channels that Steiner will intercept, 2 others through alternative routing that may reach officers more interested in truth than comfortable lies. Werner studied the envelopes, recognizing the risk Becker had taken in preparing unauthorized distribution of sensitive technical intelligence. If discovered, both men would face charges of insubordination that could result in immediate transfer to penal battalions, or worse. Yet, the alternative, allowing their discoveries to die in Steiner's censorship, meant condemning future Panzer crews to deaths that honest tactical doctrine might prevent. Send them, Werner ordered, accepting whatever consequences would follow. Every copy. Perhaps someone will listen before more Friedrichs die, believing armor will save them. The following morning brought the orders Werner had anticipated, immediate reassignment to a training unit near Munich, where his analytical skills could benefit raw recruits rather than complicate technical assessments. The bureaucratic language barely concealed its punitive intent. Werner packed his belongings with methodical care, each item carrying memories of a career built on faith in German engineering superiority that British innovation had systematically demolished. Becker appeared at his door as Werner prepared to depart, carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. From the captured British ammunition stocks, Herr Hauptmann, 1 complete APDS round for your personal reference. The Feldwebel's expression carried a mixture of respect and shared understanding of what Werner had sacrificed for principle. "So you remember what truth costs." Werner accepted the package, feeling its weight in his hands. Inside was physical evidence of everything he'd discovered: the tungsten penetrator that had shattered comfortable illusions about German invulnerability, the aluminum sabot petals that represented innovation Wehrmacht doctrine had dismissed as impossible. He would carry this ammunition for the rest of his life, a reminder that courage sometimes meant accepting uncomfortable truths, even when institutions demanded comfortable lies. As his staff car pulled away from Hillersleben through morning rain that seemed to wash away more than mud, Werner watched the proving grounds recede in the side mirror. Somewhere in those buildings, his honest reports might gather dust in classified files while German tank crews continued dying in armour that no longer protected them. Or perhaps, against all probability, someone would read his findings and recognise the truth that British innovation had fundamentally altered armour warfare. He thought of Friedrich, imagining his friend's final moments as APDS tungsten punched through the Panther's glacis at velocities that gave no time for comprehension or fear. Had Friedrich understood in that final fraction of a second that everything he'd believed about German armour superiority was wrong? Or had death come too quickly for understanding, merciful in its immediacy? The rain intensified as the car turned onto the main road toward Munich, heavy drops that obscured vision and turned the world into smeared watercolour of grey and darker grey. Werner clutched the package containing the APDS round, feeling its solid weight against his chest like a physical reminder of what he'd learned at Hillersleben. British engineers had solved a problem German ordnance bureaus had considered impossible, creating ammunition that rendered armour thickness almost meaningless through elegant application of physics Wehrmacht doctrine had overlooked. The sabot concept seemed obvious in retrospect, using lightweight carriers to accelerate dense penetrators to velocities conventional projectiles couldn't achieve. But German engineering philosophy had emphasized brute force over innovation, assuming that heavier projectiles and thicker armour would always prevail through superior metallurgy and manufacturing precision. The British had proven that assumption catastrophically wrong, demonstrating that clever design could overcome material disadvantage when institutional flexibility permitted unconventional solutions. Werner wondered what other innovations Allied engineers had developed while German bureaucracy dismissed their capabilities as crude improvisation. If British ordnance could produce APDS ammunition that negated years of German armour development, what other surprises awaited for Wehrmacht forces struggling to contain enemies who learned faster than German doctrine could adapt? The question troubled him more than personal career consequences, suggesting that Germany's defeat might stem not from material disadvantage alone, but from institutional rigidity that prevented honest assessment of Allied capabilities. 3 weeks later, in a modest apartment in Munich where Werner trained reluctant conscripts in tank operation they'd likely never survive, a letter arrived bearing official Wehrmacht seals. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on official stationery with minimal formatting. The message was brief, unsigned, carrying bureaucratic anonymity that suggested the author wished to remain unknown. Your reports from Hillersleben reached the appropriate authorities. Tactical doctrine revisions under consideration. Frontal engagement discouraged. Ambush tactics emphasized. Mobility over protection. Your sacrifice noted. Some truths matter more than careers. Werner read the words 3 times, searching for meaning beneath bureaucratic terseness. Someone had listened. His honest assessment of German vulnerability to APDS ammunition had influenced tactical doctrine revisions that might save lives through revised engagement parameters that acknowledged British innovation rather than denying it. The knowledge brought no satisfaction, only hollow relief that Friedrich's death and Werner's career destruction might prevent repetition if revised doctrine reached frontline units before Germany's final collapse. He placed the letter beside the APDS round on his desk, 2 artifacts from Hillersleben that testified to the cost of truth in institutions that preferred comfortable lies. Outside, Munich's streets echoed with sounds of American bombers overhead, their engines a constant reminder that Germany's war was ending regardless of armour innovations or tactical doctrine. Yet Werner had done what conscience demanded, choosing honesty over advancement even when institutional pressure made comfortable deception seem rational. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.